Good morning and welcome to ISO Serious Legal Compliance Without the Courtroom Drama. This is my first session, so be good to me, please. So, a bit about Statius. So, our vision to create joy in work and joy in learning for all UK SMEs, not just SMEs, but individuals, so directors, etc. How do we do this? By helping ambitious owners become great leaders by delivering better strategies, better systems, better measurement, engage people, which deliver the bit that's really important, better results. So I thought I'd start with a little bit about me, just an introduction. Hi, I'm Matt. I'm the Managing Director of Statius Management Services. Started my life as an engineering apprentice many years ago. Moved as from the apprenticeship into an engineering department, from engineering in design. That's where I first really got my first taste of standards, particularly and health and safety. So lots of rules and regulations, and I am the breaker of all things. So terribly accident prone. Honestly, I'm the worst person in the world with regards to being accident prone. But what I mean by breaker of all things and standards and regulations is we used to do a lot of work within the pharmaceutical industry, designing analytical accessories, and part of that process is we would have 40-ton presses. So what we would do there is we would have to product test, so we have to try and destroy them essentially. So it involved me going in on a Saturday morning, packing a press with sandbags, bearing in mind the presses, the side plates were 1.25 inch thick steel, and then trying to destroy it. So the best we got was 125 tons of pressure, with the side plates actually deforming by about 3 millimeters, causing the bolts to shear. Sounds absolutely wonderful and very spectacular, but packed in sand, you just heard a thud and the pressure dropped. But that's where the health and safety side come in. I then moved on and got involved with management systems, so 9001 and 14001 specifically, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as part of this presentation, and then moved into the world of consultancy, and that was 23 years ago, and that was for Statius, and here I am, I'm the managing director. So it's been a long road and many grey hairs. So what are we going to cover in the session today? So we're going to look at why choose ISO, so why choose an ISO management system, what ISO says about compliance requirements and identification, what it actually means, because it's not always English, why identification compliance requirements are important for an organization, how we can identify those requirements, how can then demonstrate that we've identified everything that complies, but also we understand the impact on our organization, how we can verify our activities, so undertake compliance check-in, and then I'd like to take you through a few of the common regulations and typical compliance things as a bit of a guide later on in the presentation. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll get to them at the end of the promise. If I don't, then we can have another Teams call and I can hope to answer anything that you may need, or we can even go for a coffee and I can bore you a few of my stories. So how am I proposing to run the session today? As I said, please feel free to put questions in. They are always wanted. In fact, please do. My mind does tend to wander a little bit, and I do love a story, but I will try to keep it relevant. There's a couple of people sitting in the back of the system for me to give me a prod if I do go off story. So if I do wander, I will quickly come back to it, I promise. Any longer questions, save them to the end, and there will be a chance to follow up. I'm happy to talk to anybody given the opportunity. So why ISO? What is ISO? ISO simply stands for the International Standards Organization. Okay, so lots and lots of different standards that ISO release, anything from manufacturing a pencil to nuclear power stations, ISO has it covered. Lots of organizations put ISO management systems in place to demonstrate their ability for credibility and trust, because it means that they have formal processes in place. If you are introducing an ISO management system such as 9001, it It proves that you have the ability to look at efficiencies within your process. Regulatory compliance control, which is what we're obviously looking at today, because there is a requirement with all ISO systems now to identify your compliance requirements. And it obviously provides you market competitiveness, as well as being able to tender for work. What we're seeing a lot of recently is most construction companies and manufacturing, there are prerequisite requirements to be able to tender for things like ISO 9001, which is quality, 14001, which is environment, or 45001, which is health and safety. If you want any information on any of those, I'm your man. So what does ISO actually say about compliance requirements? As I said earlier, it's mentioned in a number of standards. So quality, environment, safety, information security, and many, many others. But it doesn't tend to be an ISO speak. There's a lot of words there. So specific clause, so I've just picked one here, 45001, which is health and safety standard, clause 6.1.3. I didn't know that off the top of my head. I promise I'm not that sad. But I do know what it actually says. The organisation shall establish, implement, and maintain a process to determine and have access to legal and other requirements, determine how the requirements apply to the organisation, and you must take them into account when establishing, implementing, and maintaining its management system. Loads of words, okay? What does it actually mean? What is it that you need to do? What should we be doing? So what we should be doing is implementing a process to be able to identify and to keep up to date with not just legal requirements, but other requirements. And other requirements could include things like sector schemes, CHAS, construction line, Achilles, there's lots of them, client-specific requirements, harmonized standards that may apply to your product or your service or industry, any local operating controls, anything listed within particular permits, licenses, consents that are issued on the business. What do we need to do? We actually need to understand what those requirements mean for us. So what is it that we have to do? And we then design our management system to ensure that we can control and meet those requirements, because understand and then put processes in place to make sure that you can deliver on that understanding. I did say I'd like a story, so here goes. During the war, as I said previously, I come from an engineering background. We used to produce analytical accessories. We used to produce, as part of that process, that we would develop and we produce and we would polish mirrors and lenses. So one of my claim to flames is that one of the lenses that we designed and developed and manufactured is part of the Hubble telescope. So as part of that process, as I said, you sort of, you're polishing and you're developing it. Now out of that, you'll have obviously got an output, a slush, a byproduct. We actually had permission to discharge to foul sewer, that was called. It was subject to a whole load of controls. So I had a weir system set up, obviously where you've got sediment going to the bottom. I would then monitor and take readings at the bottom of the weir. So as it came out into our system, I would then monitor it again when it was coming out before it got discharged into the main sewer, the main drain on the main road there. So we had a consent in place. It was issued by the local water authority. And then one day I get a knock on the door from the local water authority. There'd been problems with drainage on the main road, and because we were obviously a permit holder and we were an engineering company and putting stuff down the drain, they thought it was our fault. Honest gov, it's not me. Invited them in, actually took them through all the controls that we had in place, showed them our permit, showed them our levels, showed them all the records that we kept of all the different monitoring points and how often they were done, which very clearly demonstrated that any issue that they were having wasn't anything to do with our process, and it's really important. During that time, there were actually three gentlemen in the road with the manhole cover up, chiseling what looked like cement from the outside of the main drain, 36-inch bore steel pipe, chiseling away. Being an analytical company, we popped over and said, any chance of having a little bit of that, please? took it into the R&D department, stuck it on one of our machines, and identified it as being 98% fat. At the top of the road, there was a high street, and there were a number of takeaways. And actually, what was happening is the takeaways were pouring the fat and the oils straight into the system without any type of controls in place. And that was what was causing the problem. But the important point to make here is, as part of our 14,001 and as part of our permit system, we had the proof, we had the records, and we had the controls in place to be able to demonstrate it wasn't us that was doing anything. Honest gov. So moving on to other identified requirements. Client requirements are a perfect example. So things like service level agreements, so they would typically be as part of a contract, particular reporting requirements, so what sort of information is required when. Monitoring, so this could be health and safety monitoring with regards to bi-weekly safety inspections on, say, a construction site, with those reports then being sent to the client for monitoring, and monitoring of procurement requirements. So there may be an element of, if you are or you do have CO2 requirements, delivery mileage, etc., that then has to be reported back. Having that information, being able to report that back as part of the contract's important, but without actually looking and identifying it and understanding it and then putting controls in place. So going back a couple of slides, there will be trouble ahead. Unless you can meet what your client wants, then not likely to be a client for much longer. So why is identification of compliance requirements important? We are all human, okay? Nobody wants that phone call. Certainly as a managing director of a business, I don't want the phone call to say something has happened. Very early on in my career, this is another story, but it's relevant, I promise. Very early on in my career as a consultant, I got involved with an accident on a lift site. Managing director was absolutely distraught, took me to one side as part of the interview and the investigation I was doing, and said, I've been dreading this for years. I've been trying to avoid this. He said, I've been, all the controls that they had in place. And to be fair, the organisation were brilliant with regards to health and safety. But as a director, it was the one call that he didn't want. And it's the call that I don't want either. So that's why identification of compliance is important, but also the associated costs of non-compliance where something has been identified. These are direct and indirect. So direct costs, things like fines, obviously regulatory fines, internal investigation costs, external support costs, things like solicitors, barristers, specialists, consultants, because we're great, where you get involved with an investigation, costs of cleanup and remediation, certainly for environmental spills and things like that. And where there has been an incident of damage to human health, you've obviously then got compensation claims as well. That's just the direct stuff. You've then got indirect as well, which is reputational damage and business interruption. What you do need to bear in mind is most organisations now, as part of the tender process, you are asked to report on EA visits, HSE visits, RIDDOR reportables, that sort of stuff. That all damages your reputation, but also damages potentially your ability to get further work. So none of us are perfect, but by identifying what you need to comply with, having those controls in place and assessing those controls, that's where you can mitigate the risk of this. Are there any questions? As I said earlier, it can be related to anything ISO, some legal compliance stuff, although we're going to come on to that a little bit later. What I had for my breakfast this morning, so I had a pasty for my breakfast this morning from the bakers because I was in a bit of a rush for this. If not, we're going to move on for the next section. So next section is how to identify compliance requirements. There's a number of ways of doing this. You've got things like paid subscription services, legislation update service, and Krona. Brilliant, honestly, brilliant services. You'll get tend to be a little bit expensive, but you get access to lots and lots of pieces of information, lots and lots of rules and regulations. You've then got to pick through that and decide what's applicable to you. You can be identifying compliance requirements through license reviews or permit reviews, as I said earlier, which is where I did with the engineering stuff, with that little story I gave you. Official regulators, their websites are excellent sources of information. Health and Safety Executive, Environment Agency, net regs if you're north of the border. So Scotland net regs is still applicable for environmental stuff. National Cyber Security Centre with regards to information security. Sector magazines are an excellent source for compliance requirements, and it tends to be very specific to that sector and what they do. And the benefit you've got there is often it will give you solutions as well to be able to meet those requirements. Contract review, so what is it the client wants? Sector regulators, so that's people like LEA, so Lift and Escalator Industry Association. They have lots of information on their website, and again, it's a bit like the sector magazines. It's very specific to the industry and often gives you good guidance on how actually you can meet these things. So how do you demonstrate the identification and understanding of ISO? So ISO doesn't say you should have a legal register or you should have a compliance register, but it's often the best way of doing it because it enables you to demonstrate that you've identified all the different pieces of rules, regulations, client requirements, other requirements that apply to your business and that you understand them and that you can then assess yourself against them. So what does a compliance register look like? Typically, it'll have obviously the legislation or other title, when it was enacted, that's if it's applicable, including any amendments. That's really important. Remember the amendments. Legislation does change, but also contracts change. So there may be amendments, so you would need to update your compliance register. An overview, that's not a detail. This is a blow-by-blow account. It is a what is it that the regulation is trying to achieve? What is the output? What controls you currently have place to meet it? You can then have compliance evidence. So what do we do and what compliance have we got? And we will come on to this a little bit later to demonstrate that we meet the requirements of that legislation, and a review date. So when was the last time I looked at it? This is an example of one of our compliance registers, so legal register in this case, but it also includes some other requirements. As you can see, we've got ISO 45001, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Management standard, and then a number of acts or regulations underneath that, including, as I said, the principal requirement, dates, basic requirements, what evidence you can use to demonstrate, and then you've got a couple of blank fields at the end here for actual recorded evidence and review date. Another little story, honestly, won't be a problem. So it's about, and I think if you remember a couple of slides ago, we were talking about things like legislation update service. You will be given lots and lots of rules and regulations on your register or on your site that is applicable. What we tend to find is a lot of third-party organisations or third-party auditors, certainly. There's a lot of overkill in legal registers. A lot of organisations that we go in that have originally identified their own legal requirements have done a very good job of it, but it's extremely complex. There's lots and lots of information. There's lots and lots of rules and regulations on there that are not really applicable to the organisation, and that's quite important. Only identify those requirements that are applicable to your business. And remember, where you are getting pressure from a third party auditor, it is your system, it is your register, and it is your business. It's not theirs. ISO just says identify the applicable, not identify every single piece of legislation that applies within the UK. Moving on to compliance check-in, this is simply an audit and a review. So where you have identified what applies, where you have identified the controls that you have in place, this is the check-in process. So it's just an audit. Those undertaking the audit should be competent to be able to do it, because you need to understand the legislation to be able to understand whether an organisation complies or not. It is just a sampling exercise, same as any audit. You should record objective evidence. Don't be afraid of raising a non-conformance. Identifying a legal breach, a non-conformity with regards to a regulation or a requirement it's good to do that internally, because once that's done, you can then put action in place to be able to close it. It's better being done when something hasn't happened until waiting to something has happened, because that's where you get the costs, the direct and indirect, that get associated with it. So always, wherever possible, be robust and identify that non-conformity. Don't be afraid, and then assign action and make sure that action gets closed. That's really, really important. What I'm going to try and do now is we're going to move on to the next section. I'm going to try and take you through some main pieces of primary safety, environment, and information security legislation. I can't cover it all. It is just a brief overview, but if you do have any specific questions around regulations or something that's happening within your industry or your business, and I can treat it as confidential, and you just want to know, this is happening and I've got this, what can I do? I am more than happy to help. So put it in the chat or drop me a line later on, and as I said, we can have a coffee or do something offline. I'm happy to do either. Like to start with the management of the health and safety at work regs, part of the 6-pack, as they called it. There's levels here. So if you have 5 or more employees, this stuff has to be documented. Less than that, you don't have to have documentation in place, but you do have to still have these things in place. So health and safety arrangements for managing health safety within your organization. You should define roles and responsibilities. So who's going to do what, where, and when. You should have risk assessments. They should be suitable and sufficient. Fantastic health and safety term, suitable and sufficient. That means that depending on the size and the complexity of your organization, risk assessments should be suitable for you. So it's no good taking something that's incredibly complex if you've got quite a simple process. So suitable and sufficient. You should have processes in place for communicating health and safety requirements, including risk assessments, and having coordination. I find that the coordination part, if you can get users, if you can get the end user, the person undertaking the task, involved in the risk assessment, it's a win-win situation, because they are actively involved. They're the ones that understand the risk. They're the ones that understand the hazards. But more importantly, they will know when a control measure will work or not work. The health and safety at work regs have specific requirements around protected vulnerable groups, such as expectant nurse and mothers and young persons. A young person is anybody under the age of 18. So if you're employing somebody under the age of 18, you have to undertake a specific risk assessment. The reason of doing that is often they have a different perception of risks and hazards because they've not had the workplace exposure. It doesn't mean that you can't employ them, and it doesn't mean that they can't undertake certain activities. It just means that you have to risk assess it. Obviously, where there's legal requirements, such as driving, you couldn't expect them to do that because they wouldn't have a license, etc. But there is nothing to stop a young person from using a drill or using a lathe, as an example. You just have to risk assess it, and it could mean that they are subject to a bit of extra training or some increased monitoring. Talking about monitoring, the health and safety work regs also require health surveillance under certain conditions. That can be conditions regarding things like hand, arm vibration and noise. There are specific regulations around that as well, but it would be health surveillance, but also where you are using substances that could be detrimental to health. So saying that, we will move on to the next one, which is control of substances hazardous to health. So COSH, as it's also known. Anything with a symbol in a red diamond would typically be covered under COSH. So one of the number of the requirements here, what you do need to do is you need to identify all products that an organisation uses that would be subject to COSH control. It's not just the products. If you are drilling into concrete, you've got silica dust, that should be subject to that is subject under COSH. That should be subject to risk assessment. And the same if you are sawing wood because of the dust, because it's a known carcinogen. So again, you should be doing COSH risk assessments on that. When I say COSH risk assessments, what we've got here is we often find it's a 50% of the story. So we go into an organisation and say, right, okay, we're just looking at COSH today. Can we see the risk assessments for that paint that you're using? They very proudly present you with a document that tends to be the material safety data sheet. That is only half the story. The material safety data sheet is developed by the manufacturer, and it contains all the information that you need to know to undertake the risk assessment. The risk assessment is how you are undertaking the work, how you are using that product. Depending on how you use that product, that impacts some of the risk. So the material safety data sheet is only 50% of the story. So that should always be coupled with the risk assessment. This information should be provided to any users, so that's provision of information. There are certain prescribed substances that you need to be aware of, and there's a whole list of those. And where you are using those, typically that could be something like mercury or lead. There is health monitoring requirements. So very important to remember. Something that we're seeing lots and lots of, something that's changing almost on a weekly basis is the world of fire, because obviously linked with Grenfell. What we've got here is, I've just picked one, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, because there are so many at the moment. Requirements for a fire risk assessment must be undertaken by a competent person. So it doesn't mean anybody can do it. They have to be competent to be able to undertake the fire risk assessment. So something like they would have a NEBOSH fire certificate. Where there are fixed installations in place, it should be subject to weekly bell testing. What I mean by weekly bell testing is the old break glass on all the exits. Don't break the glass. You can get a key and they just fit underneath. They would be done on a rotational basis. So if there's, say, 5 in the building, you would start week 1 with number 1, and then by week 5, you've come back to the beginning. Same with emergency lights. There's a regular inspection on those. And then what you have to have is you have to have an annual discharge test, where what would happen is the power is isolated for a number of hours, typically 3 hours, and you are looking then that the batteries are able to offer lighting at a suitable level for that period of time. Any fixed installation be subject to servicing as the manufacturer's instructions, but also we then got an evacuation requirement. So evacuation, typically anywhere between 6 months and 12 monthly. I wouldn't extend it any further out than that. And what you should do as part of the evacuation, you should also think about bringing those instructions into your induction process, so that any new starter is aware of muster points, evacuation protocols, etc. Out on day 1 of employment. You may need to consider things like PIPs, or personal evacuation plans, where you have people less able. So it may be that everybody gets out first, and then you have the other people taken out afterwards. You may need to introduce refuge areas as well, but this is what would come out of your fire risk assessment. One more point on the fire risk assessment: it is only half the story. Where the fire risk assessment is undertaken, any actions that are identified should be actioned and closed. That's really, it's pointless just having a fire risk assessment if you're going to ignore all the output and all the findings. They must be closed. Provisional use of work equipment, or PUA as it's also known, covers obviously work equipment. What you've got on the right here is a pallet truck. Most people know what a pallet truck is. It is used for lifting and moving of pallets and loads, typically around warehouses. Although this piece of equipment lifts items, it's covered under PUA, not LOLA. We will come on to that in a minute. So what are the requirements? So any piece of work equipment, including pallet trucks, should be subject to regular service and inspection. The only thing the pallet truck won't be subject to, although it lifts loads, are certificates of its thorough examination, because it's covered under PUA and not LOLA. There's requirements for portable appliance testing, or PAT as it's also known in the industry. The frequencies of PAT testing, or PAT, should be done and developed based on risk. Okay, so it depends on how a tool is being used, the type of life it's leading. Is it being used out on a construction site with lots of cement being thrown in the back of a van every single day, in and out, in and out? You know, the risk of damage is greater, so therefore the frequency of inspection should be greater, typically 3 monthly. Service tools, etc., which tend to be maybe looked after a bit better or used a lot less, you know, we could then potentially extend that out to a year. Where you're in an office environment, so where I am today, I'm sitting looking at my screen. My screen would typically be subject to a PAT test every 3 years, because it doesn't move. It's got a lovely life. It's got a nice office. It's all very low risk. Where you have people using work equipment, they should be competent and trained in the use. I said I'd come on to it. So we've gone from pure to LOLA, or lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations. So on the right, we've got a forklift truck, counterbalance. That's subject to 12 monthly examination by a insurance company, typically, who would issue a certificate of thorough examination. Where a piece of equipment is used for lifting persons, that frequency reduces to 6 months, again based on risk. LOLA covers storage of lifting equipment, so slings, shackles, chains, and things like that. So should be stored in a way as to prevent deterioration or contamination. So it's no good having a nice sling that you throw in the back of the warehouse and it gets covered in oil, because then that impacts and that then becomes contaminated and reduces its ability to do its job. All lifting equipment should be subject to pre-use inspection. So an example there, so we've got the counterbalance forklift, that should be subject to pre-use inspection by the operator every time it's used. So typically in the morning before it's taken out. So someone would do that and they would go through a checklist to make sure the brakes, the warning lights, tire condition, forks, etc. are all in operable condition. What we tend to find from an audit point of view is these can become tick lists. So as a little audit tip, it's often worth picking up the checklist and going through it yourself with the operator, because we often find things like the horns or the lights are not working, but they've been ticked as being in operation. So yeah, would be careful with that. Where you are operating a piece of lifting equipment, so such as a forklift truck, you should be competent and you should have qualifications to be able to operate it. So this is a counterbalance forklift truck. You can have a side reach one. There are actually different qualifications and different competence. Just because you can drive one doesn't mean you can drive the other. So it's a little different to driving a car. If you've got your license to drive a car, you can drive pretty much any car. But in this case, no, that's not the case. Counterbalance is different to side reach. So it's important to remember that. This isn't a story, this is just a piece of information. So on the left here, we've got a what they would call a man cage. This is used on forklift trucks and telehandlers to be able to access or put people to height. This is supporting a person, so therefore, yes, it is subject to 6 monthly inspection, not 12. And on the right, we've got a good old-fashioned box van or Luton van, as a lot of people know it, with a tail lift. Tail lifts, because they are lifting people and loads, subject to 6 monthly inspections and 6 monthly certificates of thorough examination. What we tend to find is these get missed. A lot of organisations will have regular servicing done, they'll have the MOTs done, because it's a vehicle. The minute you've got a tail lift on the back of it, that is then used separately and should be inspected separately. So just a little tip there for you. If there are any questions, again, anything you'd like to know, please just put it in the chat and I will come back to you at the end, hopefully. Moving from health and safety to environment, we've got the control of oil, control of pollution or storage regulations. So on the right here, we've got what they call an IBC. So it's 1,000 litres of liquid of some type sitting on a bund, which is the black capture unit sitting at the bottom. Bunds have different requirements. So if you've got a single container, so as we've got there, which is the IBC, you should have a capacity in the bund of being 110%. If the container has over 201 litres. If a bund has multiple containers on it, then it should only be calculated to 25% of the total combined volume, but we will come into that a little bit later. The idea of this is not all of the containers will break or spill or be released in one go, whereas obviously in this case where you've got an IBC, if something goes wrong there, then yes, you've got all 1,000 litres potentially being disposed of, which is why you've got the 110%. There's some Siting requirements, so you've got fire safety clearances, so 1.8 metres from any non-fire rated boundary to consider. The base should be non-permeable, non-combustible, and should extend by at least 300 millimetres on all sides. This is to prevent ground contamination. Um, all bunds, etc., should be subject to inspection and any spills cleaned up. Very, very important, keep the records of the inspections. Okay, going back to my story very early on, records will often save you. They are demonstration that you have competent controls in place and you are monitoring those controls. What we tend to find on audit is that many bunds are partially full and have never been empty, but straight away what you're then doing is you're reducing the capacity of the bund. That's where your inspection process comes in place. An oh dear to an oh yes moment. So incorrect storage of barrels to a nice tented modern bunded storage unit. So what you can see there is four 205 litre drums of something, possibly oil by the looks of it, sitting on a bund. The bund only has to be 25% capacity. So that bund would only have to be 205 litres because not all four drums would burst at the same time. That's the theory. Waste electrical and electronic equipment regulations. So any piece of equipment with a wheelie bin with a cross would be covered under WE. This is the most misunderstood piece of legislation that we see on legal registers. Many organisations list it, but it's not applicable for most organisations. It is only applicable for people, manufacturers and importers, so producers, that are placing electrical equipment onto the market. That's the important thing. So people that are putting stuff onto the market. There may be people that are watching this that are manufacturers or importers. We were as an engineering company, we used to produce control systems as part of the pharmaceutical element, and therefore we did apply to us and lots of other sort of legislation that are linked to that. But you then have a compliance scheme. So this is that distributor take back process. So if anybody has bought a fridge recently, there is a responsibility for the Currys and PC Worlds and all that to take it back because that's where it comes from. With regards to end user responsibility for we waste, that's covered under the hazardous waste regulations, and we'll come on to hazardous waste in a little bit. So as a consultancy, we work with a waste contractor based in the Thanet area. They do a lot of work for Thanet District Council, so a very big organisation. They do black bin, they do garden waste, they do road sweepings, they do refuse lorries as part of the transfer station, so lots and lots of waste, but they also do WE collection. One of the things, one of the controls that they've implemented over the last couple of years is they actually down tools and undertake no movement on any of the WE waste piles 2 hours before the end of day for fire watch, because what they were finding is when you're moving discarded WE equipment around, batteries get damaged, etc., and you end up with fires. So they actually have to stop work 2 hours early now just to make sure and monitor, because there's nothing else they can do. They can try to handle it better, and they do, but there's still a risk there. And I think we're seeing more and more in these local media now, certainly, and generally on fires with things like batteries and electric vehicles, as an example. Waste. Where do I start with this? It's incredibly complex in the UK. So unlike health and safety legislation, where you might have something like the PPE regs, which tell you what you need to do with regards to PPE, waste has just exploded over the years. There's lots and lots of different pieces of legislation that actually deal with waste. So we've got a few here. We've got the hazardous waste regulations. We've got controlled waste England Wales regs. We've got the list of waste regulations, also known as European Waste Catalogue. We've got waste batteries and accumulators regulations. So if you've been into Asda's or Sainsbury's recently, or because we might have some posh people here, Waitrose, there'll be battery bins often in the reception as you go in, and that is because they sell batteries, so therefore they have to have this take back scheme in place. And you've also got things like the Scrap Metal Dealers Act, which means you have to then be registered with the local authority if you're going to deal with scrap metal. There's so much to do with waste, but what I'll try and do is just give you some basic understanding. Few bits to remember. Non-hazardous waste are subject to a waste transfer note, or WTN. I've got an example on the right of the screen there. Okay, the waste transfer note should be retained for a minimum period of 2 years. So minimum period of 2 years should include an SIC code, or standard industrial classification code. These are codes that are put in place when you start an organization. So they're available via Company House. So if you don't know what your SIC code is, just log on to Company's House, put your company name in, make sure you've got the right company, and your SIC code will be there. So it depends, and it's listed on what it is that you do as an organization. Waste transfer note should also have an EWC code, or European Waste Catalogue code, which is in the list of waste regulations, which is on the previous slide. All that is a 6-digit unique code for the type of waste that's being disposed of. So as a description, you can't just put muck away, dirt. It doesn't work like that. You put a 6-figure code in, because that says where it's come from. So it could be miscellaneous, it could come from construction activities, it can come from manufacturing activities, but the EWC code will define that and describe that. You should have a statement on your waste transfer note with regard to applying the waste hierarchy. In section B of the example on the right, you'll see it's there. So you have to say, and you have to consider waste. So have you do you have to dispose of it? Are you looking at recycling, etc.? So you have to tick to say that you have considered it. This forms a legal document. So when this is completed, the people that are completing it, the people that are signing it, should be trained and should be competent to understanding what information needs to go on here, because it is a legal document. It forms a legal document. So putting incorrect information on here, or even worse, deliberately falsifying information, can get you into very serious trouble. So we've gone from non-hazardous or standard waste to hazardous waste. So non-hazardous waste transfer note, hazardous consignment note, very similar but just slightly different information. These have to be retained for a minimum period of 3 years, so up from 2 years for waste transfer, so minimum of 3 years. Again, has to have the EWC code, so the European Waste Catalogue, 6-digit code for the type of waste you're trying to dispose of. There'll be a number of hazard codes linked with that waste, depending on what it is. Where possible, you should list the UN number, which are available on the COSH data sheets, because that's where that information will be. So if you're getting rid of paint, for example, or any type of chemical, you should list the UN number. It should include the carrier's details on the consignment note. And right at the very bottom, you get something called a Part E. The Part E should be completed and returned back to the organisation disposing of the waste within 6 months. That's a legal requirement. And what that tells you is that your waste has been finally disposed of, incinerated, etc., and it'll have an R code or a D code on it. Waste, as I said earlier, is incredibly complex in the UK, lots of different pieces of legislation, and it is low-hanging fruit for any auditor. I'm not bragging, but I can walk into pretty much any organisation and within 15 minutes looking at waste documentation, find something that's wrong because of its complexity. Most organisations rely on the waste companies to produce that, either the waste transfer note or the consignment note, and it's concerning that often there's mistakes even though you're getting a specialist to complete them. The mistakes I tend to find would be incorrect SIC codes. So whoever's completing the waste transfer note or consignment note will put the standard industrial classification often of the waste company, not the producer of the waste. Often we find incorrect EWC codes or missing signatures, etc. So yeah, just be aware it's a low-hanging fruit for many auditors, third-party auditors, good third-party auditor will actually use it as a training exercise. So they won't issue non-conformities, or they won't certainly issue major non-conformities, because they understand the complexities, and certainly if you're getting a third party to do them on your behalf. Any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll get to them later, I promise. Moving from, so we've gone from health and safety to environment, and we're now moving on to information security. So you've got the Malicious Communications Act. I was struggling to say that last night, but Malicious Communications Act, you should have policies in place that are documented within the organisation on what malicious communications are. Staff should be aware. You should monitor emails, etc., work-related emails, etc., for malicious communication. Ensure staff are trained and understand what constitutes malicious communication, and very clear and documented disciplinary processes in place. There are consequences to non-compliance. These are criminal record, up to 6 months in prison, fines of up to £5,000. And it's important to note that this isn't for directors. Those consequences are applicable to everybody. So even people that are undertaking and actually doing malicious communications, that would be subject to them, not just directors in this case. We have the Online Safety Act, which is something that a lot of people may be aware of because it's become more forefront within the news. So there's a legal requirement to proactive, and that's the important bit, proactive, detect and remove content that could be threatening, it could be illegal, things like epilepsy training, harmful to children, etc. So we do need to monitor it, and it has to be proactively. Where it is likely that children would be interested in accessing the website, so of course, Statue's website is absolutely fantastic. And if you can look at the bottom of the screen there, you'll see the statues.co.uk and the ISO consultants websites. Give them a click. They are perfectly safe, I promise, and they do cover and are approved under the Online Safety Act. But where you do have children potentially accessing that type of information, you should be reviewing what information is contained on there. And if there is potentially something that could be harmful, then you need to have age verification processes in place. I hope everyone's still awake. We are nearly there, I promise. So what have I covered today? So I've covered why choose ISO, what ISO says about compliance requirements, and then what does it really mean? And hopefully over the last few slides, you'll understand, and you may have got a better understanding on what ISO actually requires you to do. We've then moved on to why identification is important, how to identify it. So you've got legislation update services, you've got reviews of permits and contracts, etc. How we can demonstrate that we've identified everything that's applicable to us, and that we have an understanding of the impact on our organisation, how we can undertake compliance checking, so how we can review ourselves against those identified requirements. And over the last 8 or so, 10 slides, I've taken you through some of the common regulations. There are lots and lots out there, and you may have further questions, hopefully, that we can get to at the end. So, Statius, better strategies, better systems, better measurement, engage people, delivering the better results. Does anybody have any questions, comments, visits to the website? Please go ahead.
Hello, Matt.
Hiya.
So we have a couple of questions.
Yes.
Which is great. So the first question we have is, what is the health and safety six-pack you were talking about earlier?
Yes. I mentioned that as part of the Health and Safety at Work Act 99. So what the six-pack is, it's the primary legislation within the UK. Funny enough, there's 6 of them. That would be the Management Health and Safety at Work regulations, which we've gone through, manual handling regulations, display screen equipment or DSE regulations, the workplace health, safety and welfare regs, provision use of work equipment regulations, so PURE, which we've been through, and the PPE regs, so personal protective equipment regulation. So that's what is formed and what is known as the six-pack.
Great. We have another question. So what is the typical number of regulations and acts that you might expect to see on a compliance register?
Okay, that's I wouldn't say it's a difficult one, but it's very much dependent on the industry, because some industries are probably more, are more regulated than others. But as a guide for most organisations, I would say typically maybe 15 to 20 pieces of health and safety legislation that may be applicable, 10 to 15 on the outside for environmental legislation, bearing in mind there's probably 7 of those that are waste, and anywhere between 3 and 7 information security. There's obviously lots and lots of other requirements, but if I can base it around safety, environment, and infosec, I would say, yeah, that's where we are with it.
Great. The other question we have here is how often is legislation updated?
It's formally released twice a year, so you end up with April and October releases for legislation. There are periods within the year where you've got specific requirements. So Grenfell, as I said earlier, with regards to fire legislation and acts, etc., they can be released as emergency legislation, but typically it would be April and October. So what we would do as an organisation is we would probably look to review the compliance register twice yearly at those times, and then we tend to take a view annually on legal compliance. So we would review your activities on an annual basis against those stated legal requirements.
Great. And we've just had one last one come in, which is with PPE regulations, do I need to supply agency workers with PPE?
Yes, you do now. So you didn't originally, but there's something called Limb B workers now, so agency workers. You are required to supply them with PPE. Bear in mind, most agency workers would typically come with boots, but you would be responsible for obviously supplying at zero cost all the others. You can obviously have a site boots, if you like, whatever they call them, that they can use, but then leave at the end of the day. You shouldn't really share PPE, but also where you are using labour only suppliers, obviously I am conscious that there is a cost associated with that, and someone might only be working with you for 2 days, and you don't want to then spend £70 on a pair of boots, a new hat, glasses, ear protectors, gloves, etc. You can be putting £130 onto the price of your labour. So, but yes, you do. In short, the answer is yes, you have to supply Limb B workers or agency workers with PPE under the new regulations.
Great. That seems to be all of the questions we have.
Okay, excellent. Hope everyone found it interesting and informative. And should you have any further questions, just feel free to reach out to us. Access via the websites. There's lots of blogs. There's lots of free information on there. Have a hunt around, or just drop me an email, either at info@statius or emlia@statius.co.uk, and I will get back to you with any help I can.